The cookout was Keisha Norman's idea, start to finish. She had planned it for a Saturday in late June, the kind of Indianapolis summer day that tricks you into believing the world is fundamentally generous. Blue sky so wide and clean it looked painted, the smell of charcoal drifting from 3 different yards on her aunt's block, children running through the spray of a garden hose like they had no concept of time and were proud of it. Aunt Loretta's backyard was never just a yard. It was a gathering place, a stage, a testimony to what the word family could hold when you let it. Folding tables lined up end to end under the oak tree, whose roots had been lifting the sidewalk for 20 years, and nobody seemed inclined to do anything about it. The good tablecloths with the plastic covers to catch the spills. The Bluetooth speaker playing old-school R&B at a volume that made conversation feel like an act of deliberate intimacy rather than something that just happened. Keisha had been looking forward to this day for 2 months. She was 31 then, 18 months into her role as nurse manager at Meridian Health System on the north side of the city, a job that was more than she had imagined it would be and harder than anyone had warned her it was going to be. She managed a floor of 22 nurses, navigated a hospital administration that seemed to believe that institutional problems resolved themselves if you staffed them with enough people on paper, and carried the particular weight that comes with being a Black woman in a leadership role inside an institution that said it valued diversity in mission statements, and flinched every time someone named a specific grievance in a meeting. She was exhausted in the bone-deep way that has no single cure, the kind of tired that follows you home and sits on the edge of your bed while you try to sleep and thinks about tomorrow. But today was not a work day. Today was family. She had mentioned the cookout to Priya 3 weeks earlier, the way you mention things to a coworker you have grown genuinely close to casually between patient cases, in the particular shorthand that develops in shared workspaces over time. Small details accumulate in those spaces and become the texture of something that starts to feel like friendship. You mention things. They mention things back. It builds. Priya Mehta was a charge nurse on Keisha's floor. 33 at the time, the daughter of Indian immigrants who had settled in Columbus, raised in Ohio, trained in Cleveland, transplanted to Indianapolis 2 years earlier after her second serious relationship ended, and she decided that a new city might feel less weighted. She was funny in the dry, observational way that Keisha respected deeply, no performance to it, no timing calculated for effect, just noticing things and saying them plainly. She worked hard without making a production of it. She didn't gossip about patients in the way some nurses did, using their cases as social currency. She showed up early and stayed late. She was, in the way that mattered most in the daily reality of a medical floor, someone you could count on. They had been something like friends for about 8 months when Keisha mentioned the cookout. It had started as a work relationship, the way most work friendships do, and had crossed over gradually through lunches and long text threads, and the particular closeness that comes from spending 8 to 12 hours together several times a week inside a high-stakes environment where what you do for each other professionally matters, and you both know it. "You should come," Keisha said, and she meant it with the full generosity of someone who had not yet had occasion to doubt her own generosity. "My aunt does it every summer. It's a whole thing. Good food, good people, real people, you'd like it." Priya had looked genuinely touched in a way that seemed unperformed. She had the expression of someone who had not expected to be included and was not sure how to receive it gracefully. "Are you sure? I don't want to crash something that's for family." "You're not crashing, I'm inviting you, there's a difference." And that Keisha would understand later, much later, in the way that you understand the pivots in your own story only once you have enough distance to look back at them, was the sentence that started everything. Priya arrived at Aunt Loretta's cookout, carrying a container of homemade gulab jamun that she had stayed up until midnight making. Keisha thought that was one of the most genuinely touching things she had seen from a new friend in years, the effort of it, the specificity of the gesture. Not store-bought cookies grabbed from a shelf, not a bottle of wine chosen in 10 seconds at the gas station, but something made by hand from her own culinary tradition, offered without apology or explanation to a table full of black women in Indianapolis who had never tried it and might not know what to make of it. Aunt Loretta tried one and put down her fork and looked at Priya with the directness of a woman who does not waste words. "Baby, what is this called again?" When Priya told her, Loretta repeated the name back slowly and with care, like a student making sure she had it right, and then said, "This is one of the best things I have ever put in my mouth, and I have been eating for 62 years. You need to tell me exactly how to make this." That was it, that was the moment. Keisha watched Priya laugh, really laugh, not the polite social laugh of someone at a gathering where they don't quite belong, but the kind of laughter that bends you forward at the waist and makes you put your hand over your mouth, and felt something she would later identify as pride. A specific kind of pride. I brought this person into this space. I gave her this moment. I made this connection happen. It felt generous. It felt like the best version of what she could offer. By the end of the afternoon, Priya had exchanged phone numbers with Aunt Loretta, with Keisha's cousin Tamara, with Keisha's older cousin Deshawn, who spent the better part of 45 minutes in a corner of the yard talking to Priya about South Asian cooking techniques, because he had been planning to open a restaurant for the past 3 years, and took any food conversation as both research and religion. Priya had found her way into pockets of conversation Keisha wasn't even part of, had moved through the gathering with an ease that looked natural rather than calculated, and people were smiling at her, and the sun was going down, and the air smelled like charcoal and Loretta's famous potato salad, and something that didn't have a name, but felt like exactly what the word community is supposed to mean when it means something real. Keisha drove home with the windows down, and the music turned up as loud as it would go. She felt, driving home that evening, genuinely lucky. She had found someone she liked. She had shared that person with her family. Her family liked her back. This was how the good things in life worked, one generous act leading to another, the circle of belonging expanding to make room. She had no way of knowing, on that June evening with the windows down, that the expansion she was celebrating was also the beginning of a 2-year erosion of something she had never thought to protect, because she had never imagined she'd need to. Months 7 through 14. What Keisha gave and what she didn't know was being taken. In medicine, you learn to read systems. You look for patterns in data that seem disconnected at first glance. You're trained to hold 2 contradictory pieces of information in your mind simultaneously and resist the urge to resolve them prematurely. Good clinical judgment is, in large part, the discipline of sitting with uncertainty until the picture develops fully enough to act on. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to be wrong and to know you might be wrong. It requires a certain controlled humility about what you think you already understand. Keisha Norman was excellent at this in her professional life. In her personal life, she was like everyone else. The friendship with Priya had deepened in the gradual, organic way that real friendships do, through accumulation rather than through a single event, through the layering of shared time and small disclosures, and the kind of shorthand that develops between 2 people who see each other often enough to stop performing. Lunches that started as 20-minute breaks and stretched to 45, because there was still more to say. Text threads that began about scheduling and shift coverage and became, over months, about everything else. The kind of ongoing conversation that picks up in the middle days after it technically ended, because neither person really stopped having it. In this friendship, which felt genuine and was, in many of its elements, genuine, Keisha confided. She confided fully. She confided with the kind of trust that feels like a deliberate choice rather than something that simply happens, the kind that feels like it honors the relationship you've built. She told Priya about her marriage. Her husband Marcus was a good man. She believed this then, and she believes it now without qualification. But they were in the middle of a stretch of sustained difficulty, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically but accumulates quietly until one day you look up and realize you've been in a different kind of marriage than the one you thought you were in. The financial pressure had started with his car, a transmission that cost more than they had saved for emergencies, and metastasized into the general ambient stress of two people trying to build a life on incomes that looked sufficient on paper and somehow never quite translated into feeling sufficient in practice. They had argued more in the 18 months prior than in their first 3 years combined. Not the loud, explosive arguments that at least have a kind of clarity to them, but the quiet, grinding ones, where the same essential disagreement circulates through different forms because neither person is quite saying the real thing and both people know it. Keisha told Priya about this. Not in exhaustive detail, she wasn't the kind of person who aired the interior of her marriage to anyone who would listen, but enough. She said she and Marcus were going through a rough patch. She said the money stress was getting to both of them. She said she sometimes felt like she was carrying more than her fair share, and then felt guilty for the thought, and then felt exhausted by the guilt, and that the cycling between those three feelings was itself a kind of drain she hadn't accounted for. She told Priya about the job. Specifically, she told Priya about her relationship with Patricia Hale, director of nursing, a white woman in her mid-50s, who had a particular and consistent habit of second-guessing Keisha's decisions, in ways that she demonstrably did not second-guess other nurse managers' decisions, of asking Keisha to justify protocols and processes that were never questioned when other managers implemented them, and of describing Keisha's directness in meetings, a directness that was, at most, the professional baseline for someone in her role, as aggression in ways that felt both calculated and deeply familiar to Keisha. She had seen it before. She knew what it was. She had documented 3 specific incidents in writing and was weighing whether to file a formal complaint, thinking through the risks and benefits with the methodical caution of someone who knows that institutional processes for discrimination are rarely as clean as their existence implies. She had told Priya this, across multiple conversations, partly because Priya was on her floor and witnessed some of what she described, and partly because she trusted her. She told Priya about the money. Not a catastrophe, they weren't in crisis in any acute sense. But they had dipped into savings during the car repair at a time when the savings account was already thinner than she would have liked, and the dip had produced a shame that was disproportionate to its practical significance. The kind of shame that comes from being raised in a household where financial difficulty was treated as private information protected with near-religious ferocity, where you did not let people see your business, where asking for help was only for last resorts and discussing struggle was close to forbidden. She told Priya because it felt safe, because Priya was her friend, because trust, extended genuinely, wants to be reciprocated with care. She was my work wife, that's what I told people, that's what it felt like. I thought work wife meant the vault stayed locked. I was wrong about what the vault even was. Priya's responses across all of these disclosures were appropriate. She listened with attention. She said things like, "That's genuinely so hard, and you're handling this better than most people would," and "Patricia absolutely sounds like a textbook case, document everything, seriously." She followed up the next week, asking how things were. She checked in with the specificity of someone who had actually retained what she'd been told. She seemed, by every available measure, invested in Keisha's well-being. Meanwhile, quietly and with consistency, Priya continued attending Norman family events. Aunt Loretta's birthday dinner in October, where she arrived with another homemade dish and stayed until the end helping clean up without being asked. Cousin Tamara's baby shower in November, where she brought a gift off the registry that she had clearly put thought into. A Friendsgiving that Keisha's mother Sandra hosted the week before Thanksgiving, where Priya brought a dish that had 12 family members asking for the recipe and spent an hour in the kitchen with Sandra discussing her mother's cooking before Keisha even arrived. By the time December came, Priya had attended 6 Norman family events in 5 months and was being referred to by several family members simply as Priya. Without any qualifier, without context, the way you refer to someone who belongs to the group rather than someone who was introduced into it. Keisha thought this was wonderful. She said so, explicitly, to Marcus one night while they stood at the sink doing dishes, the domestic routine of a married couple moving through the kitchen in the comfortable choreography of two people who have learned to share a space. I love that she fits in so well with everyone. It's genuinely rare to find someone who can move between worlds like that, who can show up in a space that isn't theirs and make it feel like they belong. Marcus dried a plate. He had a way of being quiet that held more thought than silence usually holds, and the look he gave her was one Keisha couldn't fully parse. She's at a lot of things, he said. She gets invited, the family likes her. I know, a pause. I'm just saying, she's at a lot of things. Is that a problem? He handed her the plate. No, just noticing. She didn't press it. She would revisit that moment many times in the 2 years that followed, turning it over the way you turn over a rock at the beach just to see what's underneath it. Marcus had noticed something. He had said something. She had heard it and set it aside. She should have done something different with it. She should have pressed. The first moment of wrongness happened at Tamara's baby shower, and it was small enough that Keisha could have let it pass, and very nearly did. She was standing near the gift table in Tamara's living room, talking to Janelle, the wife of her cousin Deshawn, about nothing in particular, work schedules, a movie they'd both seen, the kind of conversation that moves easily because it doesn't need to go anywhere specific. The afternoon was warm and full of that particular baby shower energy, which is its own kind of overwhelming. Bright decorations, women who love each other talking over each other with affection, the presence of new life reducing everything else to its proper scale. Janelle said, in the middle of a different thought, Tamara mentioned you and Marcus have been going through it lately. That sounds really stressful. How are things now? Are y'all doing better? Keisha paused. She held the sentence in her mind for a moment, the way you hold a piece of data when something about it doesn't quite compute. She looked at Janelle's face, which was open and genuinely caring, the face of someone asking from a good place. She and Tamara were close, but they hadn't spoken much in the past few months. Tamara was deep in the late stages of pregnancy, managing the logistics of her impending life change, and Keisha had been slammed at work. When they did talk, it was quick, catch-up calls that lasted 20 minutes. Keisha was almost certain, not entirely certain, but almost, that she had not told Tamara about the rough patch with Marcus. She had told Priya. She did the calculation quickly and quietly, the way nurses learn to do mental calculations in environments where hesitation costs time. The information could have reached Tamara through Priya. That was one explanation. There were other explanations. Maybe she'd mentioned it in passing during one of those quick calls and forgotten. Maybe Tamara had picked up on something in tone or energy and drawn her own conclusions. Maybe Janelle was extrapolating from something small into something that felt larger than it was. She told Janelle things were fine. She thanked her for asking. She steered the conversation somewhere else. On the drive home, she turned the moment over carefully. One data point, one anomaly, not a diagnosis. She filed it under probably nothing and let it go. The second moment happened 6 weeks later, at her mother's house for Sunday dinner. Sandra Norman had a way of asking questions that were not really questions. They were assessments delivered in question form, with a precision that 30 years of motherhood had honed into something very close to an art. Keisha had been navigating this her entire life and had developed the particular armor of someone who has been assessed since childhood. She answered economically, withheld strategically, kept the visible topsoil of her life accessible while guarding the roots. She was not closed with her mother, but she was careful. There was a difference, and she had always understood the difference. Sandra was cutting cornbread with her back to Keisha, and she said, in the same tone she used for everything from weather commentary to medical advice, "So are you and Marcus getting counseling, Or are y'all just going to keep riding it out? Keisha set down her fork. The kitchen was ordinary around her, the sound of something on the stove, the smell of collard greens, the particular quality of afternoon light in a room she had grown up in. Everything familiar, the question landing in it like a stone in still water. What makes you ask that? Her mother shrugged, and the shrug was the kind that means I know more than I am currently choosing to say, and I know that you know that. Just checking on my child. We're fine, Mama. Where's that coming from? Sandra said, setting down the knife. I just heard you two have been struggling some, financially and otherwise. I'm your mother. I want to know these things. Who told you that? A beat, just a beat. Her mother turned around and did something Keisha had almost never seen her do in a direct confrontation. She looked away. Sideways, toward the window, as if something outside required her attention. Mamas. It's nothing, it just came up in conversation. With who? Sandra's jaw set in the way it did when she had decided she was done with a particular line of questioning. I'm just trying to be a mother, Keisha. I'm trying to know what's happening with my child. The conversation moved on because conversations in families move on. There are other people, there is food. There is the ambient noise of a family dinner that covers over things that might otherwise sit too long in the air. But Keisha sat at that table with a feeling that had no clean name, something that lived just below the sternum, a pressure that wasn't quite pain but was certainly something real. A wrongness that she could feel in the body, even before the mind finished assembling the logic of it. She drove home in silence. Her mother knew about the money. Her mother knew about the otherwise, which meant the marriage. Janelle and likely Tamara knew about the marriage too. She thought about what these people had in common. She thought about who had been at every family gathering in the past 8 months. She thought about the conversations she'd had at work, in the break room, over lunch, in the particular intimacy of two people talking quietly in a busy hospital where you have to lean in close to be heard. She thought about the list she hadn't made yet. She started making it. The feeling wasn't anger yet. It was closer to the feeling you get when you can't find something you know you left somewhere specific. That low, wrong-footed wrongness. Like the floor has been tilted by 1 degree and nobody else can tell. Keisha Norman was, at her core, a methodical person. She had trained herself to be over years of education and practice in an environment that left no room for sloppy reasoning. Nursing requires the ability to observe systematically without letting observation become interpretation before you have enough evidence to support interpretation. It requires careful documentation. It requires the discipline to resist drawing conclusions until the data is strong enough to bear their weight. It is both a professional skill and, for Keisha Norman, something closer to a survival skill. The particular armor of a woman who had spent her career in institutions where her credibility was perpetually available to be questioned, and where the luxury of being wrong once without consequence was one she had never possessed. So she made a list, methodically, systematically. Not a physical list at first, she wasn't ready to make it that real yet. A mental one, running and continuously updated. Every time she noticed a family member referencing something that Keisha had shared exclusively with Priya, something with no other plausible pathway to their knowledge, she noted it. The date, the family member, the specific information referenced, the context in which she had originally shared that information with Priya. She held these data points carefully and did not draw the conclusion they were pointing toward until she had enough of them to be certain. She wasn't constructing a narrative from nothing. It took 4 months. By the end of those 4 months, the pattern was not remotely subtle. In January, her cousin Marcus Jr., 20 years old and refreshingly, sometimes exhaustingly, without a filter, had told Keisha at a birthday dinner that he'd heard she was having a hard time with a racist boss at work. He had said it with genuine sympathy and the directness of a young man who hadn't yet learned that there are things you don't say out loud even when you know them. Marcus Jr. had never been told about Patricia Hale. Keisha had not mentioned the director to anyone in the family. She had discussed Hale in detail, across multiple conversations with Priya, in the break room, over lunch, in the specific language of someone working through a problem with a person she trusted. In February, Aunt Loretta had offered to loan Keisha money. The offer had been unsolicited, gentle, prefaced with the kind of warmth that was meant to make the offer feel natural. I know sometimes things get tight, and that's exactly what family is for. Keisha had felt a shame so sudden and physical it was almost nauseating, not at Loretta's offer, which came from love, but at the exposure it represented. She had not told Loretta about the financial situation. She had told Priya. In March, at a family dinner at her mother's house, 3 separate aunts had asked Keisha, in 3 different conversations, whether she and Marcus had considered counseling. Not because anything explicit had been said, these were careful women, women who understood the protocols of family conversation, but in the particular way of people who love you and have been briefed. Probing, gentle, calibrated to what they know rather than to what they're supposed to know. Keisha had told Priya about her marriage struggles with the specific, vulnerable language of someone who trusted the person they were speaking to. In April, cousin Tamara returned from maternity leave, in the emotionally porous state of a new mother whose nervous system has been reshaped by sleep deprivation and love, had pulled Keisha aside at a family gathering and said quietly, "I just want you to know that whatever you and Marcus are going through, I'm not judging you. Marriage is genuinely hard. We all know it's hard." And then she had hugged Keisha in a way that felt slightly, unmistakably, like condolence. Keisha had thanked her. She had kept her face completely still because she had been keeping her face still in difficult moments since she was 8 years old, and she was very good at it. And she had added the moment to the list. 23 items, in the end. 23 instances where specific information that Keisha had shared only with Priya appeared, in some form, in a family member's knowledge or behavior. She sat with this list for 2 weeks before she decided what to do with it. The picture it assembled was uncomfortable in its clarity. Priya Mehta had, over 2 years, cultivated independent relationships with at least 6 members of Keisha's extended family. She had attended family events without Keisha present in at least 2 instances. Tamara had mentioned, casually, that Priya had stopped by during her maternity leave when Keisha was at work, stayed for over an hour. Priya texted regularly with at least 3 family members, and had been seen mentioned in family group chats Keisha was on, as a participant in conversations that had started with other people. And in those relationships built, Keisha now understood, with deliberate consistency if not necessarily with a fully premeditated scheme, Priya had apparently shared things. Information that was Keisha's. Information that Keisha had shared in the context of friendship and professional trust, under the implicit assumption that it stayed where she put it. The thing that occupied Keisha's mind longest was not the what but the why. She turned this over for weeks, during her commute, during the quiet parts of night shifts, during the minutes before sleep when the mind does its most honest work. Was it malicious? Was it thoughtlessness on a grand scale, the behavior of someone who genuinely didn't register that information shared in confidence belongs to the person who shared it? Was it the way some people tell other people's stories without recognizing that the stories aren't theirs, because they have never developed the ethical reflex of asking whose information this is before they use it? Or was it something more intentional? Was there something Priya gained from occupying the position of the person who knew things, who knew Keisha's family, who knew Keisha's secrets, who could walk into a room full of Normans with the standing of an insider rather than a guest? She didn't know, and she knew she might never know with certainty, but she knew what had happened, and she knew what she needed to do. I stopped confiding in Priya around month 19. I just went quiet, and I watched, carefully, specifically, to see if the family references stopped. They did. That was the confirmation I needed. That was when maybe became definitely. Aunt Loretta Williams was 62 years old. She had been married to the same man for 38 years, which was a fact she never mentioned as an accomplishment, but which was one nonetheless. She had raised 4 children in a house on the east side of Indianapolis, had sent all 4 of them to college, had buried her youngest son Derek when he was 27 in the car accident that rearranged the family's emotional geography permanently. She had survived a breast cancer diagnosis at 54 with a matter-of-factness that the rest of the family found both admirable and slightly unnerving. She had taught English in Indianapolis public schools for 30 years and had strong opinions about grammar, about language, and about character. These 3 things, in her view, being more closely related than most people understood. She was the person Keisha trusted most in the family. Not because Loretta told her what she wanted to hear, she never did, but because Loretta told her what she actually thought, and she thought carefully before she spoke, and she had earned, over 62 years, the credibility that comes from being consistently right about people. Keisha asked to come over on a Wednesday evening in early May. She said she just wanted to visit, which was true in one sense, and was also the most delicate framing she could find for what she actually needed to do. She brought food jerk chicken from the place Loretta liked, a container of rice, 2 portions of plantains. Not as a bribe, she told herself, but because she always brought food to Loretta's house, and she didn't want to change the patterns on the night she was planning to change everything else. They ate at Loretta's kitchen table, which was the same table Loretta had owned for 20 years, with the same plastic tablecloth that had been replaced twice and looked almost the same each time. They talked about the family, about an upcoming high school graduation, about Harold's ongoing negotiation with his knees, about the summer plans. Loretta made coffee. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled, of something that had been cooked earlier in the day and coffee, and the particular cleaning product Loretta had used for as long as Keisha could remember. And then Keisha set down her mug and said, "Auntie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." Loretta set down her mug too. She looked at Keisha with the stillness of someone who has been half expecting this particular conversation and has been deciding, in the waiting, how to handle it. "Tell me what you know," Keisha said, "about what Priya has shared with you, about me." A silence that lasted long enough to matter. Outside, a car passed slowly. The refrigerator made its soft mechanical sound. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked with the patience of something that doesn't need an answer. "Keisha," Loretta said. Please." Another silence. And then Aunt Loretta pressed her lips together in the particular way that means, "I have been carrying something I shouldn't have been carrying," and she said, "I wondered when you were going to ask me that." What followed was a conversation that lasted 2.5 hours and covered more ground than Keisha had expected to cover in a single evening. Loretta was careful about the specific words she attributed to Priya. She was not willing to become another conduit of information, another relay point in the communication structure Priya had built. What she gave Keisha was the architecture rather than the individual bricks, the shape of what had been shared, the context in which it had been delivered, the framing Priya had consistently used. Yes, Priya had shared things. Loretta confirmed this plainly, without defensiveness. Not in a gossipy way, Loretta was clear about this distinction, and Keisha believed her. Nothing had been delivered with the relish of someone who wanted to damage. Priya had done it in the manner of a person who presents herself as being in your family member's corner, who uses intimacy as a credential that licenses disclosure. She had positioned herself as someone who was worried about Keisha, who thought the family should be aware of certain things in case Keisha needed support, who was sharing because she cared. She made it sound, Loretta said, choosing her words with the precision of a former English teacher, like she was watching out for you. Like the sharing was a service she was providing to us, on your behalf. She made herself the person who cared the most about you. The person who knew things the rest of us didn't, and who was generous enough to fill us in. Keisha was very still. She made herself the bridge, Keisha said. Yes, that's right. And bridges are central. Bridges are what you have to use to get from one side to the other. She was the bridge between you and your own family. Keisha sat with that, the image of it, the structure of it. Did it change how people see me? Loretta did not answer immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, carried its own weight. Some people developed certain ideas, she said carefully. About you and Marcus, about whether you were managing well, about the difficulties at work. Nothing was said badly, I want you to understand that. No one was gossiping about you unkindly. But when people are given information, it shapes the lens they look through. You know that. Keisha knew that, she knew it in her bones. Your mother was worried about you in a way she would not have been worried if she hadn't been informed. Loretta paused on the word. That's the right word. Informed, like she received a briefing. Who else? Tamara worried. Some of the cousins had opinions they wouldn't have had. Deshaun was asking me questions about you and Marcus that he had no reason to be asking. Loretta looked at Keisha directly. And I'm ashamed to tell you this, I accepted the information. I took it in. I adjusted my picture of you without ever asking whether the information was mine to receive. This cost Loretta something to say, and Keisha could see it costing her. She reached across the table. You didn't know, that's the whole point. Nobody knew she was doing it, so nobody could push back. I should have asked myself, Loretta said quietly, how Priya came to know these things. I should have asked why you hadn't told me yourself, if these things were things I needed to know. Yes, but you trusted her because I trusted her. That's how it worked. She used my trust as collateral. Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she said the sentence that Keisha would repeat to herself for months. She was painting a picture of you, and you didn't know you were being painted. Yes, Keisha said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. That's exactly what it was. The most painful part wasn't that they knew. It was that for 2 years I had walked into rooms full of the people I love not knowing they were seeing me through a filter Priya had constructed. I thought I was just myself in those rooms. I wasn't. In the days following the conversation with Aunt Loretta, Keisha moved through several distinct emotional phases with the methodical attention of someone who has learned to observe herself the way she observes patients, with care, without flinching, with a commitment to accuracy over comfort. The first phase was grief. Uncomplicated, unqualified grief for a friendship she had believed in and that had, in its way, been real. She had genuinely liked Priya, not performed liking, not the politeness dressed as affection of a professional relationship, real liking, the kind that sees something in another person and is glad for it. She had liked Priya's dryness, her competence, her apparent lack of the kind of social performance that exhausted Keisha in most group settings. She had thought she saw a genuine person and had responded with a genuine friendship. The friendship had been built on something real, which meant the betrayal was built on something real, and that is its own particular shape of sorrow. The second phase was anger. It arrived late and stayed long, and was the cold, precise kind that Keisha had learned to respect in herself, not the hot reactive anger that moves fast and lands badly, but the kind that knows exactly what it's angry about and takes the time to be specific. She was angry that her private disclosures had been used as social currency. She was angry that Priya had built a position of intimacy inside the Norman family, using Keisha's own stories as building material, Keisha's own pain and difficulty, and humanness as the bricks of her construction project. She was angry that her mother had been worrying unnecessarily for 18 months. She was angry that her aunt had been carrying information she never asked for and had adjusted her understanding accordingly. She was angry that she had walked into family gatherings not knowing that a filter existed, not knowing that the room had been prepared, that the information landscape of the people who loved her most had been arranged by someone who wasn't authorized to arrange anything. The third phase had no clean name. It was something like retrospective vertigo. She began reviewing 2 years of family interactions through the new lens, and what she found was not comfortable. The moments of unexpected gentleness that she had attributed to the general warmth of her family now carried a different possible explanation. The probing questions her mother had asked. The particular way Tamara had looked at her at certain gatherings. The offers of help that came at odd moments, unsolicited, over-targeted. She could not always distinguish between what had been shaped by Priya's disclosures and what was simply how her family loved her. The two things had been layered on top of each other for 2 years, and the layering could not be entirely undone. The fourth phase was decision. She made a plan. The plan had 3 components, each addressed in sequence with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to move through difficult tasks one step at a time, rather than trying to do everything simultaneously and doing nothing well. The first was documentation. Over a full weekend, she wrote out, as specifically and precisely as she could manage, every piece of information she had shared exclusively with Priya, cross-referenced with every corresponding instance of a family member demonstrating knowledge of that information. She was rigorous about this, not vague impressions, not feelings of having been exposed, but specific statements from specific family members that corresponded to specific disclosures she had made to Priya in specific contexts. The list, completed, was 23 items long. Reading it back to herself in one sitting was a particular kind of sobering, the kind that makes you sit very still and breathe carefully for a moment. The second component was a conversation with Loretta. Not to ask Loretta to fight her battle, she was clear about this in her own thinking, but to share the documented evidence with the one person who both understood the family and had the standing and the will to address what had happened within it. Loretta needed to see the full picture, not just the part she had already assembled from her own position. The third component was the most complex, determining how to handle the professional relationship with Priya while protecting her own well-being and continuing to do her job with integrity. People who heard the outline of this story, even partial versions of it, had a consistent instinct about what Keisha should have done, confronted Priya directly, sat across from her and laid out the evidence piece by piece and demanded an accounting. Said, "I know what you did. I know how you did it. I know when you did it. Now explain yourself." Keisha understood the appeal of this. There is a satisfying clarity to the direct confrontation, a completion in naming the wrong to the person who committed it. She thought about it carefully. She considered it seriously. And then she decided, for reasons that were specific and practical rather than principled in the abstract, not to do it. First, Priya was articulate, emotionally intelligent in the tactical sense, and skilled at reframing. A direct confrontation would almost certainly produce one of 2 outcomes: flat denial delivered with enough conviction to create doubt, or tearful apology framed as misguided care that Keisha would have no way of evaluating for sincerity. Neither outcome served her. Neither moved anything forward. The confrontation would be for Keisha's emotional satisfaction, and Keisha decided that her emotional satisfaction was not worth the cost of what would happen next. Second, she was Priya's supervisor. She managed this woman every day. A direct personal confrontation would make the professional relationship functionally impossible, and the professional relationship had to continue. Keisha was not willing to let Priya's behavior complicate her professional environment any further than it already had. She had worked too hard and too carefully to protect what she had built at Meridian to allow a personal situation to undermine it. Third, and most importantly, the damage had not been done to Keisha's feelings alone. It had been done inside the Norman family's relational ecosystem. It had been done using Norman family relationships as the transmission medium. The family deserved to understand what had happened in their own midst, what they had been given without their knowledge, how their understanding of their own family member had been shaped by an outside source without their consent. This was not just Keisha's story to resolve. It was a story about what had been done to all of them. So she gave the documentation to Loretta. She sat with her aunt for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon and walked her through every item carefully in order. Loretta read. She asked questions. She was quiet in stretches that told Keisha she was taking it seriously. And at the end, She said the thing Keisha needed to hear more than any other thing. You're not constructing something from nothing. This is real, and it's more extensive than I knew. Yes, Keisha said. I'm sorry I was part of it without knowing. I'm sorry I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. You didn't know. That's the whole structure of what she built. It only worked because none of you knew. Loretta was quiet. Then, I'm going to talk to Priya. Okay. And I'm going to talk to the family. All of them who need to understand what happened. This was harder to absorb. The idea of her family knowing the full scope, her struggles, her marriage, her work difficulties, all of it laid out now in a different context, produced a complicated feeling in Keisha's chest. But she understood that the privacy was already gone regardless. The only choice remaining was whether the family's full understanding of the situation would be accurate or not. Tell them everything, Keisha said. Tell them the full truth. I would rather they understand clearly than continue operating on partial information that someone else gave them without my knowledge. Keisha was not present for this conversation. She had not asked to be, and Loretta had not suggested it, and both of them understood why. Loretta was speaking on behalf of the family, about how the family's trust and relationships had been used without their knowledge. Keisha's presence would have transformed it from a family reckoning into a personal confrontation, and they both believed the family reckoning was the more necessary thing. Loretta called Priya and asked her to come for coffee. Not at a family event, not at the hospital where the professional dimensions would complicate everything, but at Loretta's kitchen table, the same table where Keisha had sat 3 weeks earlier and begun to understand the full shape of what had happened. The symmetry was not accidental. Priya had come, apparently not knowing what the conversation was going to be, or perhaps having some uneasy presentiment, but deciding to appear regardless. She had brought a box of the Indian sweets Loretta had loved at the cookout 2.5 years ago. Loretta set the gift aside on the counter without opening it, and said, without preamble, "Before we have coffee, I need to have a serious conversation with you about something important." And then Loretta, who had taught English for 30 years and knew exactly what language could do when you wielded it with precision and purpose, laid it out. She named the specific information. She named the specific family members to whom it had been delivered. She named the context, concern, care, the framing of someone watching out for Keisha, in which the information had been presented. She was not loud. She was not theatrical. She simply stated what had happened as a series of facts, with the calm authority of someone who has done enough difficult things, in 62 years, to know that clarity is more powerful than volume. Priya had, according to Loretta, initially attempted to reframe. She said she had only shared things because she was worried about Keisha. She said she thought the family should know in case Keisha needed support. She said she thought she was helping. Loretta had let her finish. And then she said, Keisha is a 34-year-old woman who is fully capable of deciding what her family knows about her life. You made that decision for her, for 2 years, repeatedly, without her knowledge or consent. That is not support. That is a substitution of your judgment for hers, in a space she never invited you into. Priya had been quiet. You came into this family because my niece trusted you and opened a door that was hers to open. You used the access she gave you to place yourself at the center of this family's understanding of her. You made yourself the person who knew things we didn't know. You used her private struggles to build your relationships with us, and none of us knew what we were participating in. A longer silence. Then, according to Loretta, something shifted, the reframing stopped, the explanation stopped, something more honest appeared in its place. I didn't think of it that way, Priya had said. Which way did you think of it? Loretta had asked, not unkindly, precisely. Priya had not answered that question directly. She had said she was sorry. She said she hadn't intended to hurt Keisha. She said it had come from a genuine place of caring about Keisha, which she understood now was not an excuse for overreach, and that she was sorry. Loretta had said, Keisha doesn't need your apology through me. What the family needs is to understand what happened clearly enough to correct the picture. And what you need to understand is that what you did was a serious breach, not just of Keisha's trust, but of this family's trust in you. We invited you in. We welcomed you. We believed you when you presented yourself as a friend. You used that position. Priya had left without the coffee. The box of sweets sat on Loretta's counter for a week before she gave it to a neighbor. Loretta called Keisha that evening. She understands now, she said. Or she presents as understanding. Whether she becomes someone different because of it is between her and whatever she does next. That's enough, Keisha said. That's what I needed. Aunt Loretta said to Priya, "You made yourself the person who knew things we didn't know." That sentence. I rolled it around for weeks. That was the clearest possible description of what happened. That was the whole thing in one sentence. Loretta did not call a family meeting. This family was not theatrical in that particular way. The production of the formal gathering to address a dramatic event felt wrong for what had happened, too performative, too likely to redirect the energy toward the event itself rather than the understanding that needed to happen. Instead, she did what she had always done when something important needed to be addressed within the family. She made phone calls. She visited people in their kitchens. She had the conversations one at a time. Keisha had given her explicit permission to tell the full story, and Loretta told it fully. Not a softened version. Not a version that protected anyone's discomfort by leaving out what was uncomfortable. The full scope of it. 2 years, 23 documented instances, the specific pattern of cultivation and disclosure that had shaped the family's understanding of Keisha without anyone's knowledge or consent. Sandra Norman, Keisha's mother, was quiet when Loretta told her. She said nothing for long enough that Loretta thought the line might have dropped. And then she said, "I owe my daughter an apology." She called Keisha the next morning. Not at a convenient time before 8, which was not her habit. She said, "I want to tell you I'm sorry. The things I said to you, the questions I asked, the way I worried, I was working from information I had no business having, that you didn't give me, that came to me through a channel I didn't question. I should have questioned it. And I'm sorry for the ways it made you feel scrutinized or assessed." She said this without hedging. Without the qualifications that defensive apologies contain. Without any of the "but I meant well," or "I was just worried" framing that transforms apologies into negotiations. Keisha had cried, not from pain, from relief. From the specific relief of being seen correctly by someone who had been seeing her through a wrong lens. The lens was gone now. She was just herself again in her mother's eyes. Cousin Tamara had called the same day, angry in the clean, focused way of a person who knows exactly where to direct it. "She used us," Tamara said flatly. "She used our relationships with you to make herself matter to us. That's not friendship. That's not even close to friendship. That's a manipulation I don't have a word for." Keisha appreciated this. She appreciated that Tamara's anger landed entirely on Priya and did not orbit Keisha even slightly. It was the difference between being on the receiving end of blame and being treated as the wronged party, and the distinction mattered more than she had expected it to. Cousin Deshawn said very little. He had absorbed what Loretta told him, asked a few quiet clarifying questions, and then simply stopped responding to Priya's text messages. He didn't announce this. He didn't explain it to Priya. He just went quiet in the particular way of a man who has updated his opinion of someone and has no further business with them. The cousins who had been on the periphery of the information flow, who had heard things without fully knowing the source, processed it each in their own way. The common thread across all of them, as Keisha heard about it through Loretta over several weeks, was a version of the same feeling. The sense of having been used as props in a play they didn't know they were performing. The family's warmth toward Priya, their inclusion of her, their affection, all of it had been, without their knowledge, the mechanism of someone else's project. This was not something people absorbed easily. Before she took any of the steps she eventually took, Keisha had spent considerable time thinking through the professional implications. She was Priya's manager. The fact that Priya had done something deeply wrong in their personal lives did not change the professional obligation Keisha had to manage her fairly, consistently, and without allowing personal injury to become professional retaliation. This was not a moral luxury she was extending. It was a professional standard she held herself to, and she held herself to it because she believed in it, and because she knew the difference between those two things. Priya, in the months following the conversation with Loretta, was professional in the way of someone working hard to demonstrate that they understand the ground has shifted and are committed to not making it worse. She arrived on time. She did her work with precision. She was respectful in every interaction with Keisha, appropriately deferential in the professional sense without being obsequious. She did not attempt to address what had happened at work. She did not try to apologize in the workplace, which was the correct instinct, bringing the personal into the professional space when the professional space needed to remain intact would have been a second error on top of the first. Keisha managed her exactly as she managed everyone else on the floor. She gave clear expectations, consistent feedback, fair evaluation. She documented what needed documenting and let pass what didn't require documentation. She did not treat Priya preferentially in either direction. On several occasions, she had to advocate for Priya in scheduling discussions, and she did, because the advocacy was warranted, and her job was to advocate for warranted things regardless of who the person was. The friendship obviously was finished. This was understood by both of them without either of them saying it. The lunches ended. The text threads went silent. The particular warmth of the relationship, the shorthand, the mutual disclosure, the thing that had felt like a genuine connection across different backgrounds and experiences, was gone. What remained was a working relationship between two competent medical professionals who had nothing further to share on a personal level. Keisha found, to her own mild surprise, that she could live with this. She had prepared herself for it to be harder than it was, for the daily proximity to be a form of sustained injury. It wasn't. Professionalism, when practiced consistently, creates its own structure. The structure held. What she worked harder to hold was the interior aftermath. People talk about betrayal as if it is primarily an event. The discovery, the confrontation, the resolution, as if the emotional architecture follows a linear path from wound to healing, and if you handle all the external pieces with enough intelligence and grace, the internal damage repairs itself in proportion. Closure as a destination. Healing as a project with a completion date. Keisha knew, from years of clinical experience, that this was not how bodies worked. She suspected, and confirmed over the following months, that it was not how minds worked either. In the months after the full revelation, she noticed changes in herself that she had not fully anticipated and did not entirely welcome. She had become precise about information in a way she hadn't been before. Not secretive, she had always been somewhat private, but this was different, more conscious, more deliberate. She was aware of what she was sharing, when, and to whom in a way that had previously been automatic. She ran small calculations before speaking that she had never run before. This was not entirely unhealthy. The capacity for appropriate discretion is a genuine life skill. But the fact that it cost attention now, where it hadn't before, was something she grieved. It was a form of innocence she had not known she still had, until it was gone. She had also become aware of the family's perception of her in a new way. For 31 years, she had walked into family gatherings as herself, simply as Keisha, as Sandra's daughter, as Loretta's niece, as Tamara's cousin. Her standing in the family was something she had never had to think about managing, because it had never occurred to her that it could be managed by someone else without her knowledge. The idea that someone had been curating the Norman family's understanding of Keisha Norman for 2 years, had inserted a new self-consciousness that she had to actively work to not let settle into permanence. She started therapy 4 months after everything came out. She was clear with herself about why, not because she was falling apart, but because the experience had raised questions that extended well beyond Priya. Questions about what she had been taught, growing up, about keeping things private versus protecting yourself through silence. Questions about why the information she shared at work and the boundaries between professional and personal had not triggered more caution in her than it did. Questions about the relationship between competence and vulnerability, about whether the professional image she had spent years building had created a kind of isolation she had never noticed because it was self-imposed. These were questions worth sitting with a professional. She sat with them. I had to grieve the friendship first, the version of it I believed in. Then I had to grieve the version of myself who didn't see it coming. That second grief was longer. It required more honesty. She and Marcus went to couples counseling, beginning about 3 months after the revelation. She has been asked whether the counseling was related to Priya, whether the breach caused by Priya's disclosures was what sent them, and her answer is careful and specific. No. They went because their marriage had needed attention for a while, and the clearing away of the Priya situation had, strangely, made it easier to focus on the actual interior of their relationship rather than on the contamination that had surrounded it. The rough patch had been real. It required real work. They did the work. The marriage is better now. Not because the hard things disappeared, but because they were named, addressed, and metabolized. Because two people who had been circling a real conversation had the real conversation and found each other on the other side of it. She also, in the months following, filed the formal complaint against director Patricia Hale that she had been putting off for 18 months. She had been weighing the risk, calculating the cost, doing the particular math that Black women in professional settings learn to do when they consider whether to name what they are experiencing. The Priya situation had clarified something for her. She had been keeping the complaint in a drawer because she was afraid of being wrong, of being seen as difficult, of the institutional machinery grinding against her. But staying silent about things that were actively harming her was not neutrality. It was just silence. And silence had costs she had been paying without naming them. The complaint moved through a long and uncomfortable process. Director Hale was ultimately placed on a formal performance improvement plan, not the full accountability Keisha would have wished for, but a documented acknowledgement that her account was credible and her concerns were real. Something had shifted. Her voice had been recorded in a document that existed now. That was not nothing. Nothing is not a small thing when you have been told for years that you are making something out of nothing. She has been asked, by more people than she expected and in more contexts than she anticipated, whether Priya was malicious, whether there was a scheme, whether the 2.5 years of cultivated relationships and consistent information sharing was the product of intention or carelessness, of deliberate manipulation or a profound failure of conscience that produced the same results as manipulation while remaining technically innocent of it. Keisha's answer evolved over time, and the evolution is itself informative. Initially, she believed the answer was probably no, that Priya had not been malicious in the sense of wanting to damage Keisha, that she had done what she had done from a combination of social instinct, poor understanding of the ethics of information, and a genuine if catastrophically misguided belief that she was providing a kind of care. The concern framing felt real, at least in its origins. Priya probably did care about Keisha, in some version. That didn't make what she did acceptable, but it made it possible to understand without fully condemning. But the more Keisha thought about it, the more she understood that malicious and intentional are not the same question, and that the question she was actually asking was the wrong one. The cultivation of family relationships was intentional, not accidental, not incidental, not the byproduct of simply being likable. 6 separate family members, 8 events in 5 months, individual relationships maintained through independent text conversations. This was the product of consistent, specific effort. You don't build that by accident. The information sharing was intentional. Priya made choices, repeatedly, over 2 years, to share specific pieces of information with specific family members in a specific framing. She chose the frame of concern. She chose the timing. She chose the recipients. These are not the actions of someone who carelessly said the wrong thing once. They are a pattern of behavior that was sustained over a significant period of time. What Keisha ultimately concluded was this: Priya had never asked herself a question that should have been obvious. Whose information is this? Does it belong to me to share? Is the person this information belongs to present in this conversation, or have I become a substitute for their own voice? The answer to all three questions, applied with honesty, would have stopped everything at the beginning. Priya never applied them. That might not be malice in the legal or dramatic sense, but it is a failure of conscience that looks identical to malice from the position of the person who was harmed. And Keisha had come to believe that the difference, while philosophically interesting, was functionally irrelevant to her own experience of what had been done. She built a position at the center of my family's understanding of me. Whether she knew that's what she was building or not, she built it. Brick by brick, for 2 years with my own material. That is what happened. Keisha Norman is 34 years old and has always believed that openness is a form of strength. That's sharing yourself with the people in your life, your actual self, not a managed performance of it, is an act of courage and the foundation of meaningful connection. She still believes this. She is not interested in becoming the kind of person who holds everyone at a distance, who treats every potential friendship as a risk management problem, who never fully trusts because trust can be misused. But she has learned things she didn't have before. She carries them now, and they are not light. She has learned that introductions create independent variables. When you bring someone into your family, you create a relationship between them and your family that exists outside your control and outside your visibility. That relationship belongs to them now. What is said in it is said without you. This is true of any introduction. It is only a problem when the person you introduce understands the structure and uses it. But knowing the structure is its own form of preparedness. She has learned to act on data sooner. She had 2 early signals: Janelle at the baby shower, her mother at Sunday dinner, and she talked herself out of both of them. Not irrationally. The alternative explanations were plausible. But she knows now that when something feels wrong across multiple independent instances, the feeling is the data, and the data requires action even before the picture is complete. She has learned about the laundering function of care framing. "I'm just worried about you" is one of the most effective covers available to someone who has overstepped. It transforms surveillance into concern, disclosure into advocacy, the mining of another person's privacy into a service performed on their behalf. The care frame does not prove that care is absent, but it also does not prove that it is present. The question is always, care for whom, at whose expense, with whose permission? She has learned about the specific vulnerability of competence. The image of a person who has it together, which Keisha had spent her career building and maintaining, because in her professional environment she understood it was necessary, makes certain things invisible. It makes the needs invisible. It makes the struggles invisible, or it makes them legible as weaknesses rather than as ordinary human difficulty. When Priya transmitted Keisha's struggles to the family, she transmitted them through the frame of someone whose life was supposed to look a certain way. And the gap between that frame and the reality of difficulty was what gave the information its charge. The performance of invulnerability, Keisha understood now, had been costing her in ways she hadn't noticed because the cost was spread across years. She has learned the difference between a work relationship and a friendship, even when the line blurs, especially when the line blurs. The two things can coexist, but they require separate frameworks for how information is handled. A work relationship exists in a professional structure with specific obligations that friendship does not have. When she extended the trust of a deep personal friendship to someone inside a professional structure, she did so without the usual friendship-building process that tests and calibrates the level of trust over time. They had been colleagues for 8 months when she began treating Priya with the intimacy of a much longer friendship. 8 months is not enough time to know what kind of person someone is. She had moved too fast. Not stupidly, the friendship had felt real and earned. But faster than the evidence of character warranted. She has learned, finally, that patterns reveal character. Priya did not make one mistake in one moment of poor judgment. She did the same thing consistently, across 2 years, across multiple family members, across dozens of separate decisions to share information that didn't belong to her. A pattern of behavior sustained over time is a description of character, not a collection of accidents. This is the lesson Keisha carries most carefully, because it applies not just to how she understands what happened, but to how she approaches everyone she meets going forward. Not with suspicion, but with patience. With the willingness to wait for enough repetitions to know what the pattern is before she decides what it means. The Norman family is resilient. It has survived harder things than this: deaths and divorces and illnesses, and the ordinary accumulation of disappointments that every family large enough and old enough eventually holds. What happened with Priya was not the hardest thing this family had faced, but it left a mark, and Keisha is honest about that without catastrophizing it. Some of the marks are genuinely good. Her relationship with Aunt Loretta is closer now than it was before the whole thing happened. That seems paradoxical, but it makes sense when you think about what closeness actually requires. The willingness to go through something difficult together, to have honest conversations that less secure relationships couldn't withstand, to show what you're made of when what you're made of actually matters. Loretta had been placed in an uncomfortable position without her knowledge or consent. She had responded with honesty, with integrity, with a willingness to take action on someone else's behalf even when the action was uncomfortable. She had never for a single moment suggested that Keisha had done anything wrong in trusting a friend. These are not small things. These are the things that deepen love. Her relationship with her mother is different in ways that have mostly turned out to be improvements. Sandra's apology, unqualified, early, with no defensive justifications attached, was not something Keisha had expected from a woman who had spent her life demonstrating emotional self-sufficiency as a virtue. That she offered it, and that she offered it so cleanly, told Keisha something about her mother that she hadn't fully known before. They are more careful with each other now in the way that people become more careful after a real conversation, not careful in the watchful, guarded sense, but careful in the attentive sense, the sense of paying better attention. Tamara is, if anything, more fiercely loyal to Keisha now than she was before, with the particular loyalty of someone who was used against their will and objects strongly to having been used. Cousin Deshawn's quiet removal of himself from Priya's communications was its own form of support, not performed, not announced, just done. The harder marks. There is a residual self-consciousness in Keisha when she enters family gatherings, a ghost of the awareness that this space was arranged around her without her knowledge for 2 years. She knows the arranging is over. She knows the picture has been corrected. The intellectual knowledge and the bodily knowledge are on different timelines. The body is slower to revise. She works with this. Priya is gone from the family entirely, and it is understood by everyone involved that this is appropriate. The relationships Priya had cultivated with individual family members did not survive the revelation of how they had been built. When you understand that an affection was in part constructed on material that wasn't legitimately obtained, it is difficult to continue feeling the affection in the same form. People were fond of Priya. They are no longer fond of Priya. The fondness was built on something Keisha didn't authorize and doesn't regret the removal of. A year after the conversation at Aunt Loretta's kitchen table, Keisha Norman is 34 years old and sits with her husband on their back porch on summer evenings, in the same Indianapolis summer that brings the blue sky and the smell of someone else's charcoal and the distant sound of children in other yards. They talk. Sometimes about serious things, the marriage, the therapy, the ongoing daily work of two people who love each other and have decided to be honest about what that requires. Sometimes about nothing in particular, which is its own form of intimacy, the intimacy of not needing every conversation to be about something important. She is still a nurse manager at Meridian Health System. She is still the most competent person in most rooms she walks into and still has to navigate an institutional culture that is not naturally inclined to acknowledge this. Director Hale is on a performance improvement plan. The complaint that Keisha filed exists in a document now, and that document exists in a system, and the system, for all its imperfections, recorded that her account was credible and her experience was real. This is not justice in any full sense, but it is not nothing either. She sees a therapist every other week. She started because the experience raised specific questions she wanted to answer with help. She has continued because the questions keep opening into other questions, in the way that honest self-examination tends to work, and she has found the process valuable in ways that extend well beyond the Priya situation. She is learning things about herself that she didn't have access to before, about the shapes that early experience leaves in adult life, about what it costs to be a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of world, and to not let anyone see the cost. She has a small, close circle of friendships, women she has known for years, women whose characters have been tested by time and circumstance and found to be what they represented themselves as. She is not closed to new friendships. She has made one, cautiously in the past year, a woman from her neighborhood, someone who has given her more than enough time to observe the pattern before drawing a conclusion. She moved slowly. She watched. The pattern was good. She deepened the friendship accordingly. She does not regret the cookout. She has been asked this directly by people who know the whole story, and she takes the question seriously before answering it. The invitation was genuine. She meant it with full generosity. She would not have done differently with the information she had at the time, because no reasonable person, given the information she had at the time, would have. The regret she carries is not about the invitation itself. It is about the data points she had and dismissed, the discomfort she felt and overrode, the moments when something was wrong and she chose an explanation that was less threatening than the accurate one. She moves faster now when something feels wrong. This is perhaps the single most useful thing she took away from 2.5 years of something she never wanted to go through. The feeling is the data. Act on the data. The cookout was in June. The summer was generous. The sky was painted, and the charcoal smelled like summer, and Aunt Loretta ate gulab jamun for the first time and said it was one of the best things she had ever put in her mouth. All of that happened, and all of it was real, and Keisha drove home with the windows down and felt lucky. And then other things happened that were also real and less generous, and that required a different kind of summer, several different kinds of summers, each one gradually cleaner than the last to get through. Keisha Norman got through them. She is still getting through them, in the ordinary way that people continue moving through the things that have happened to them, carrying what they learned and setting down, as carefully as they can, what they no longer need to carry. That is the whole story.